Hey, everybody, we got a great one today, for a change. And this time I really mean it, because joining me is Jamelle Bouie, op-ed writer for the New York Times. We start off talking about the millions of undocumented immigrants that Trump is going to deport. Trump and J.D. Vance keep referring to the Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio as illegal, when in fact the Haitians in Springfield are legal immigrants who were admitted legally into the country and were sought out to fill jobs that needed filling in their fair city. But none of that matters to Trump and Vance, neither of whom, it seems, has the slightest bit of compunction about lying about people who, like my grandparents, came to our country for a better life. Of course, what is weird, if I may use Tim Walz's term, what is weird about Vance is that he acknowledged that he and Trump knew the eating pets thing was a lie before Trump told it during his debate with Harris. That is weird. Now, Trump, has no compunction about lying. He repeats the same lies over and over again, even though they've been shown to be lies over and over. My current favorite is that it's legal in blue states not only to have an abortion all the way through the 9 months, all the way up to 9 months, but it's perfectly legal to kill a baby after he or she has been born. Infanticide is legal in blue states around the country, according to Trump. Now, how do you suppose they execute the newborn? And who does it? The OBGYN, a nurse? Certainly not the mom, I would hope. That's dark. That's dark. Okay, but when Tim Walz calls these guys weird, it fits like a glove. Of course, Walz and Vance will be going at it on Tuesday night. Vance is a graduate of Yale Law School. Walz is a high school social studies teacher. I think that gives Walz the advantage. Oh, one piece of breaking news. The Secret Service announced that as an extra precaution, they're going to have Trump wear a disguise whenever he plays golf. Well, that's a silly thing to announce. Okay, right now the presidential race is neck and neck. North Carolina is in play. The Republican candidate for governor, Mark Robinson, a.k.a. the Black Nazi, had his campaign team abandon him after the revelation that Robinson called himself the Black Nazi on a porn site a few years ago. Trump has been touting Robinson as Martin Luther King on steroids. I think he's more Hitler on acid. Well, Jamelle Bouie from the New York Times joins me today for a great one. On acid for a change. I've been a fan of your columns, but I've been watching a couple of the TikTok videos, and you did one on Springfield and Trump wanting to deport, he says, 20 million, what he calls illegal aliens or illegal immigrants. And in it, you say that, how do you do that? First of all, you're saying it's probably about 10.5 million,
right?
Something like that. How do you do that? And you make the observation that they probably wouldn't, pick up John Hamm.
Right.
And I laughed at that, and I thought that'd be a really good SNL sketch when Hamm hosts. They pick him up, and he's like a businessman in Manhattan, but he left his wallet in the cab, and he gets deported, and they just take him through the whole thing. Because Trump and Vance have been calling the Haitian immigrants undocumented,
right,
or illegal. They're legal. They're completely documented, right?
Right. What's so troubling about Trump and Vance's line on this is exactly that. The vast majority of these Haitian residents of Springfield are legal immigrants admitted under the Temporary Protective Status program. So they have documentation. The government knows they're there. They are there in large part because the leaders of Springfield specifically were trying to get people to come to fill
Right.
jobs that were there. But Vance and Trump kind of declaring them quote unquote illegal aliens. Vance even saying, I don't care what their status is, I'm going to call them illegals or something to that effect, is really troubling because it suggests again that the aperture for who constitutes someone to be deported is actually has nothing to do with your legal status. It has to include, just by virtue of the numbers they're citing and the language they're using, it has to include people with legal status. It has to include people who have green cards. It has to include people who are permanent residents. And it has to include people who are native-born citizens, who may, for example, speak English as a second language. There are plenty of native-born American citizens born on this soil who grew up in primarily Spanish-speaking households and
Sure.
may not necessarily have the kind of strong English language skills you would expect of a native-born American. And in any case, in that world, that's who you'd be rounding up. And that's before you get to sort of the actual concrete logistic issues that would inevitably result in serious abuses, to put it lightly.
Yeah. The other side of this is their willingness to call people that they know are documented, willingness to call them illegals, even after they know they're legal. So this is their willingness to lie.
Right.
I mean, which is no small thing. It shouldn't be. It's very troubling that we have a guy who's Trump, whose willingness to lie is carries no penalty.
It's very strange. The campaign, both candidates, both Trump and Vance, kind of just lie with their full chest all the time. Now, for Trump, these are like absurd lies. Obviously, from the debate, you remember the cats and dogs.
Yeah, cats and dogs, of course, is the one that has to do with Springfield. But there's things like, that it's legal in a lot of blue states to kill a baby after it's born.
Right.
And he keeps saying this, and he says it over and over again,
which is just murder. I mean,
yes.
What's so absurd about it is like it's an abortion where they kill the babies after they're born. It's like you're talking about murder. That's
infanticide.
That's already a crime.
Yeah, but he won't stop doing it, no matter how many times he's corrected on it. Now, in your most recent column, you talk about people who respond to pollsters that they don't know who they're going to vote for. Some of these are people who pay little or no attention to political news.
Right.
Okay. And you also said that the don't knows are about half the number they were in 2020.
Yes, there are far fewer this time around
that
than
makes sense.
in the previous election.
Everybody knows who Trump is. Well, who are these don't knows? Why don't they know? Tom Edsall had a long piece in the Times about a conspiracy-oriented constituency that has little regard for the truth. Okay, these are like MAGA people, and they follow. He says they follow Alex Jones. His radio show gets 2 million listeners a week and a huge online presence. And people who watch professional wrestling, which claims a weekly audience of 15 million people. In the first season of SNL, we'd do 3 shows, and the off week they'd have professional wrestling, and it would get more numbers than we did. Now I realize why Hulk Hogan was a featured guest. Were you confused by that at the Republican convention?
I was a little confused by it insofar that, Hulk Hogan was, an old wrestler back when I was a kid. So it's like, I mean, I get getting a professional wrestler. I feel like if I were trying to be more in tune with young men, who I think that was supposed to appeal to, I would have looked for like an MMA fighter of some sort. But I got where they were going with. It's just sort of like, Hulk Hogan, a little long in the tooth.
We got a vice presidential debate coming up. Do people watch that?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, this is obviously all this stuff is my job. I totally forgot about it.
Well, when is it happening? Is October 1st? What are you looking for there? Well, but if you forgot about it, you haven't been giving it a lot of thought.
No, I mean, I've thought about it a little bit, and it's I mean, the first thing is that none of this is going to make any particular difference in the outcome. I think that if I'm JD Vance, I'm just like on the attack against Walz and Harris and the Biden administration nonstop, which is going to mean, right, like a constant stream of lies that are going to be impossible to check in the moment. Unless the moderators decide to do some fact checking, he's just going to be going with it. If I'm Walz, I'm making the case for the ticket. I'm defending the tickets program. I think I'm trying to draw, what is maybe the most important contrast, which is that like the job of the vice president is to be a heartbeat away from the president, is to be someone who could be president.
Right.
And I think I would focus on the fact that like Vance is just a child. He's 41. He's served in Congress maybe 18 months, if that. He has no particular experience in governing whatsoever. If I were Walz, I'd probably point out, and he lies a lot. So how could he trust what he's saying? And this guy is going to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. And I would just hammer on that Trump's choice of Vance shows how unprepared Trump is to be president, to say nothing of Vance.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I mean, that's like the main thing you want to get. But like, I can't imagine that Americans are going to watch this, but something like 57, 58 million people watch the debate.
I think it was
half
67,
of that,
I think.
67.
Yeah. And the ones who do are political junkies have already decided what they...
Right. They already know who they're voting for, so...
But an incredibly close race, anything can make the difference. Well, like take North Carolina. Mark Robinson, okay, is the candidate for governor there, is Republican-endorsed candidate for governor. Obviously, all this stuff came out that he did on a porn site a few years ago.
Yes.
And his campaign manager and pretty much everybody on his team has quit, which tells you they believe that this was him. He called himself what, a black Nazi?
Yes, in all caps with exclamation marks.
Okay. So it wouldn't be something if that made all the difference. If Trump loses North Carolina by 300 votes or something.
Yeah, I think it's very plausible. So let me rewind. In the polls, Trump and Harris are basically sort of tied in North Carolina. I think it's tied with like a slight Trump advantage, but for all intents and purposes, it's just tied. And it's totally possible, right, that if Robinson's campaign is completely collapsed, which means that there's sort of no field work being done, there's none of the stuff you're trying to do to get voters out, it's all just the Trump campaign, but Robinson is still kind of on top of mind for a lot of voters, and he'll still be on the ballot. I think it's very possible that he ends up just sinking the entire Republican ticket, and that could give Harris a win. And Harris winning North Carolina does it doesn't render a Trump victory impossible, but it renders it extremely difficult. At that point, Trump has to kind of run the table everywhere else.
Well, he has to do Pennsylvania.
Right. He has to do Pennsylvania. He has to do one of Michigan or Wisconsin. He has to do it. I mean, he doesn't have any other path but to run the table in the Midwest if he loses North Carolina. If he loses North Carolina and Georgia, then that's the ball game.
So it would be, I mean, how did they nominate this guy?
Well, I mean, as I'm sure you're well aware, Republican base voters are, if not at best indifferent to actual political knowledge and expertise and, interest in governing, and more often just actively hostile to it. And so Robinson, who is the sitting lieutenant governor, wins because North Carolina, he's just like, he's a MAGA troll. And that's sort of what Republican base voters want. And he won the nomination on that basis. It helps, I think, that he's black. And so this black MAGA troll, it allows you to say we're not racist.
Right.
Which is funny, right? Like,
yes, that's why I laugh.
We're not racist. We elected the black Nazi. Only in America can we elect a black Nazi.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's Republican base voters, and this is the case across the country.
And how many columns do you do a week? You do 2?
I do 2.
Uh-huh. And what are you writing one now as we speak?
I just before we began speaking, I filed a column on Vice President Harris suggested that she would support creating an exception to the filibuster to pass a bill codifying Roe, and there's a bit of a backlash and hubbub about that. So I'm just writing about that whole dynamic.
Okay, Manchin really got up in arms about that.
Right.
It's interesting to try to get an exception. I guess they've done that. They've done exceptions to the filibuster before. Have they done that?
Yes, there are basically two categories of things that can get through the Senate exempt from the filibuster.
Well, stuff that's just all about money and
Right.
economics is stuff that you can. But that's the normal. That's the normal rule. It's just, have they created a specific rule for one piece of legislation?
No, they haven't, and that's an interesting thing to think about. Would it be a specific rule for like abortion related stuff? You could imagine, we're not going to have a filibuster for rights related legislation.
I don't know if the parliamentarian would pass this.
Well, this would just be Senate rules. There's nothing in the rule book that says the Senate can't make its own rules in this way. So the
I should know
parliamentarian,
this, but
I don't think the parliamentarian wouldn't have anything to say with something like reconciliation, right? It's sort of the parliamentarian is interpreting existing rules.
Mhm.
But if the Senate just passes a rule that says bills dealing with voting rights and abortion rights are not subject to the filibuster, then that's just what the rule is.
Well, I'm embarrassed asking you, but can you pass that with just 51
Yes, it only takes a bare majority,
to
but it
change
has
the
to be
rules?
change the rules. But I believe in don't quote me on this. I believe it does have to be 51 senators. I do not think that
The vice
50 senators
president.
plus the vice president can vote to change Senate rules. And that just might be. I don't think there's anything constitutional about that. That just might be tradition, right? Like the vice president's unusual because they're obviously president of the Senate, but like that's mostly a formality that has no particular content to it. And so the tradition has been the senators elected to the Senate, they are the ones who determine the rules.
So the chances we have 51 are pretty low.
Pretty low.
Yeah.
I would say they are as low as the odds of Trump winning in 2016, which is to say low, but not impossible.
Hmm.
And kind of depends on basically what happens in three
Ohio
races
and Montana and Texas and Florida.
in Nebraska.
Oh, Nebraska has a Senate race. It's
A very competitive one. The Republican Deb Fischer is neck and neck with Dan Osborne, who is an
Mhm.
independent candidate, a union leader, and it's neck and neck. They're basically tied.
And Maryland is going to be a close one too, as well.
Yeah, Maryland may be close. I think Maryland will likely break for
The Democrat
the Democrat.
Angela also Brooks. I mean, she's running against Hogan.
That's right.
Yeah, who was a very good governor for what, 2 terms at least, right?
Yeah, two-term governor. But the thing is, of course, that like in heavily Democratic states, they'll vote for Republicans for governor. And Massachusetts had Charlie Baker for some time.
Sure.
But when it comes to sort of like federal representation, they tend to not.
Okay, talk about Rick Scott. I know his opponent there, Debbie Murcassel Powell, is in a very tight race. It's about like 2 points, right?
But yeah, Rick Scott, who has never really won a Senate election or any election in Florida, any statewide election with more than like a half point margin. So he's not. I mean, he really just hangs on by the skin of his teeth every time, which means this should be
Another close one.
another close one. The issue, and as I'm looking right now, in the most recent poll of the race, which covers basically the past week, Scott is up 2.
Wow.
One interesting thing I've been wondering about is there is obviously a large Haitian American population in Florida. And there's sort of it's like a wild card. Like how many of them are registered to vote? How many of them vote for Democrats? How many of them are attentive to the election? Like a bunch of questions you can't answer basically.
Right.
Depending on how things happen, I wouldn't rule out the possibility
That they could decide this race and decide the fate of the Senate and decide whether we could pass something reinstating Roe.
Right. I
with
mean,
51
not
votes.
just reinstating Roe, but can Kamala Harris, if she wins the presidency, can she have a cabinet? Does she? Can she now? Can she confirm judges? If she wins, I'd say there's a decent chance that Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan may consider retiring. Can she replace 2 Supreme Court justices.
But if they don't have 50, then they don't retire.
Right. If Alito and Thomas decide they can't hold on for 4 more years, then that opens up something. I mean, there's a lot that rides on whether or not Democrats can pick up a Senate majority, even just 50 senators.
50 would make, because Walz then could make the difference.
Right.
Yeah. I think this debate is going to be interesting because I know Tim, and I think he says, well, I'm a social studies teacher. I'm not, he went to Yale Law, but that's him messing with expectations or trying to. But I think this is going to be, I'm looking forward to it. I think you're right, though. There'll be a lot of lying on the other side.
Right. I'm interested to see how it plays. Vance is, to me, interesting because he seems to think that he is appealing to lots of people, but basically in every favorability poll, he's like the least popular person on either ticket. I think in the NBC News national poll, his net favorability was like -13. Next below him was socialism, and then next below him was Project 2025. So he's more popular than socialism or Project 2025, but less popular than basically everything else.
Well, let's talk about 2025. This is, I think, a very scary thing, right?
Right. I think it's worth saying that for every Republican administration, the Heritage Foundation puts out what's called this mandate for leadership. This began in 1980 with Reagan, and it's essentially like a plan. The Heritage Foundation, like, here's what we think you should do to run a Republican executive branch, Republican administration. What makes this one especially worrisome, in addition to just like the radical ideas on hand, is that the Heritage Foundation has really leaned into the notion that Trump has some sort of like mandate to be an authoritarian. And so much of Project 2025 is about stripping away as much as possible limits and barriers and obstacles to the exercise of presidential power, as well as, gutting labor law and, attempting to outlaw, as much as possible, like the public expression of LGBT identities and, trying to gut existing civil rights enforcement, like all these other things. But the marquee thing is sort of allowing Donald Trump to act as much as possible like a strongman.
And replace the state, the deep state, with his deep state.
Right. With people who are not so loyal to the Constitution or loyal to the mission of the agency, but personally loyal to Donald Trump and his political aims, which is just fundamentally against the American tradition. Even during the spoils system, in the pre-civil service era of American government, there was still this idea that the basic commitment of federal civil servants was to the Constitution. And although you may be postmaster under Lincoln and you're a Republican and you support Lincoln, and maybe you might even use that, to advantage Republican candidates. If Abraham Lincoln asked you to break the law, to violate the Constitution, you would probably say no.
But Trump's people won't.
Trump's people will not. I mean, that's explicitly what they're screening for. They're screening for people who, when confronted with the law and with Trump, will choose Trump.
And the Justice Department will be, he'll replace all those people with his people.
That's right.
And he has said that, right? And he said that on day one, revenge is going to take over.
Yes, and the Supreme Court has said in Trump v. U.S. that the president, in fact, has the authority to work very closely with the Justice Department. Independence, the tradition of independence between the president and the Justice Department for the court is not necessarily, necessary. And so I think that if a Trump administration wanted to use the Justice Department to investigate its political enemies, to tie them up in, legal troubles, all that, I think the Supreme Court would just look the other way and say that's the president's prerogative.
That is very scary.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You did a TikTok on tariffs. Tell me about tariffs.
Sure. One of the consistent polling findings is that Americans trust Trump on the economy more than they do Harris and more than they do Biden. I've always found this baffling for the simple reason that the economy collapsed under Trump. And although you can say, well, it's the pandemic.
Well, that was the pandemic.
You can say that, but the president's mismanagement of the pandemic.
Absolutely. But was a pandemic, and the pandemic contributed also to inflation.
Right.
because
Right.
if it'd be interesting if in these debates they actually had enough time to have a substantive debate on the economy and how and what the history of this economy is, because I
Right.
think that they never can have that discussion.
It's interesting. It's so if both the collapse and inflation are the product of the pandemic, Biden gets responsibility for the inflation, um, and then Trump evades responsibility for the pandemic, and it's like
Right.
it's a lopsided thing.
And for the unemployment
Right.
and then he also always goes, well, gas was $1.22 when I was when I was in office. Well, yeah, because we were in a depression.
Right. No one was driving. I think my car sat like in my driveway for like 6 months.
And industry wasn't operating either.
Right.
So you couldn't have your workers come to the factory. And so that's how gas got down to whatever it was.
But so Trump's big economic plan this time is what he's telling voters is that, like, we'll have massive tariffs. He's suggested between 10 and 20% general tariffs on all imported goods into the United States, and then a 60% tariff on all goods coming from China. And he says this will raise trillions of dollars, and it will pay for everything.
What's so funny about that is, of course, China doesn't pay the tariffs.
Exactly. Right.
So we should explain that to people.
Yes.
That when there's a tariff, who pays that? And that's who's ever importing the product, right?
Right. So tariffs are paid by the importer. Typically, the importer will treat them as a cost of business and pass it along to the consumer. And this is what happens when under Trump we imposed tariffs on a variety of manufactured goods coming from China. It raised the prices of things like dishwashers and washing machines and so on and so forth. And we can expect the same to happen under this regime, except by much, much worse. The Harris campaign has been saying that this would amount to a sales tax on Americans of about $4,000 for the typical household. The estimates I've seen put 4,000 at the high end, at the low end about $2,000. But either way, the typical family would be spending a couple $100 more every month on the same basket of goods, just because of the tariff. I think it's important to put the tariff in conversation with some of Trump's other plans, right? So the tariff, a big tax increase on most Americans.
Also, last time our China put tariffs on our agricultural goods,
Right.
made it impossible for us to export soybeans to them and corn and all these things that Minnesota farmers grow.
Right. And the administration had to pay subsidies in the tens of billions to make up for the fact that American farmers could no longer sell their goods to one of the world's largest markets.
And they did that after several farmers lost their farms.
Right. So the tariffs put upward pressure on prices and would likely, because they're likely reducing economic activity because people are not spending as much on other things. I mean, there's kind of a cascade effect on that. But then there's also the mass deportation plan. And even if it's not 10.5 million people, let's say they get 2 or 3 or 4 million people, immigrants, undocumented or illegal, are concentrated in certainly agriculture, but also construction, also medical care, and removing millions of people from those labor forces won't result in like a sudden upswing of wages and Americans can get those jobs. No, it'll result in an upswing in prices because there'll still be demand. There just won't be the ability to
fill it.
satisfy it.
Yeah.
And so you'd likely, tariffs plus deportation stand a pretty good chance of just like crashing the American economy, causing a sudden inflation spike, taking a lot of money out of the economy, eventually sort of like crushing demand in the economy, and immiserating a lot of people. A lot of people might lose their jobs. A lot of people will lose their ability to take care of their families. And then you add in Trump's other agenda items, wanting to gut the Affordable Care Act, wanting to, President 2025 calls for large cuts to programs like SNAP, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
That's food stamps.
Food stamps, right?
Yeah.
Calls for large cuts to all these programs. Basically, what he's running on is I'm going to crash the economy and then destroy the government's capability to assist the people who are hurt by me crashing the economy. his big tax cuts he wants, no taxes on tips or social security benefits or overtime, would deprive the social security program of payroll tax revenue and require large social security cuts and eventually large Medicare cuts. It's like a conservative wish list of like, slashing the state, but he's running as if it's going to be all prosperity and all, sunshine and roses and bunnies and puppies and such.
And how do Democrats and how does Harris tell this to the American people?
I I'm not a campaign strategist, and because I don't live in a swing state. I'm here in Virginia, and we're kind of off the table. I don't really see any ads. I'd have to maybe drive down to North Carolina, get a hotel room, put on a game, and like listen to ads or watch ads or do the same in Pennsylvania to see what kind of ads people are here seeing. But like if I were cutting ads, I would just cut an ad. You remember the ad against Clinton's healthcare program back in '93? This is an ad that has like two older people at like a kitchen table, being like,
Harry and Louise, is this?
yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Harold and Louise, Harry and Louise. I'd cut an ad like that and just be like, it's Trump as president, and this older couple, with they've lost their Social Security, they've lost their Medicare, they can't afford to pay for their groceries, all this stuff, and just be like, this is what you get if you put this guy in office. I would take maybe you could call it some demagoguery, but I think it's called for in this case.
So what states are we're looking at? We obviously have the blue wall states, which are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And if she takes those three, it's really hard to beat her, right?
Yeah, that's the ball game. If she takes those three, that's the whole ball game.
Except Lindsey Graham tried to get the one district in Nebraska taken off the map. Nebraska and Maine each have this thing where they give the two senators seats, they count that, and then they give each individual congressional seat has a vote.
Right.
So Lindsey Graham went to Nebraska to try to convince them to get rid of that law.
Right, which failed. Nebraska doesn't look like it's going to take that path.
Right.
One of the key lawmakers says he's not gonna go for it.
I think he was the key because he was the tiebreaker.
Yeah.
And so imagine if history tells us that was that guy, that profile and courage.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's very plausible that one guy may end up keeping Donald Trump out of office. So if Harris wins Pennsylvania, which would likely mean she's won Wisconsin and Michigan as well, like they're all kind of similar states, and Pennsylvania is like the more conservative of the three, then that's the ball game. She gets to 270, and the rest is just sort of gravy, which is why everyone's paying attention to Pennsylvania in particular. If she doesn't win Pennsylvania, there's kind of two alternative paths. The first is kind of the southern path. She still needs to win Wisconsin or Michigan, preferably Michigan. But then if she wins Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona and Nevada, then that's it. If she cannot win either one of North Carolina or Georgia, she's kind of stuck.
I think she wins North Carolina.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like making predictions. I would say that she's in it. They're both in good positions to win either of these. There was a very good piece in the American Prospect by Rick Perlstein about polling, him noting that historically our polling is not particularly reliable when it comes to presidential elections. And I'm sort of the opinion that this election is just so unusual in so many ways that I'm not sure that anyone can really model the electorate in a way that gets us sort of like a good result. And even if they could, the various assumptions that pollsters bring to each model can, produce very different results.
So you're saying we don't know?
We don't know. We think it's going to be very close, and that might well be the case. Could be the case that it's not close at all in either direction. Could be the close that the electorate is much Trumpier than anyone really can see, and then boom, it's 10 p.m. on November 5th, and Trump is like swept, Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, and we can assume that he's probably going to sweep the rest. Vice versa, the electorate could be much more Democratic than we think. In which case, could be 10 p.m. and Harris, they can call Pennsylvania, they can call Georgia, North Carolina, and that's the ball game. So I'm at this point where I'm like, I'm just gonna pay attention to what's happening. I'm gonna like as far as my job is concerned, I'm going to work on trying to like explain things, but I'm going to stay away from predictions or strategizing because
That's
I'm not
wise.
necessarily sure that's helpful, and there's not much I can add in any case.
That's very wise. And what's your next column going to be on? I mean, you said you've posted this one, but do you know how far in advance do you work?
Exactly one column in advance.
Okay.
So, now that I've written this one, I could not tell you what my next column is going to be on.
And your process is?
My process is I follow the news. I see things that I'm interested in. I'm always reading things. I spend a lot of time reading history in particular. And so I have my preoccupations, and usually those kind of filter in to the column. And so, for example, this thing I wrote on the Harris filibuster stuff it's like one part about the silliness of like kind of hyping up the filibuster as this critical aspect of democracy. But it's the bulk of it is actually just me kind of walking through one of the insights of the framers of the Constitution. They don't include any kind of supermajority rule for ordinary legislation in the
Right.
Constitution. And that's because their view is that bicameralism itself acts as like an extra majoritarian measure, that just by dividing the legislature, you've created a new barrier that serves some of the purpose the filibuster would serve. And that when you start to kind of break down the structure of the Senate, it becomes very clear that you don't really need an additional supermajority rule on top of bicameralism, on top of, each state gets 2 senators, on top of long terms and staggered elections. And I make the point, which is informed by some reading in political theory I've done, that time is like a thing you have to consider here too. That if for Republicans who have passed their big tax cut in 2017, they had to win 2 consecutive cycles of federal elections. And that's separate majorities, you can say, separate segments of the population. And that should count. Like the fact that to do anything in Congress requires winning over time should count when we're thinking about what ought to be the thresholds for action.
And they were able to do that because that vote was just majority. It wasn't a 60.
Right. And my view is that, if a political party, wins the House in multiple cycles, wins the Senate after multiple cycles, and wins the presidency, and they do so kind of on a set of like common or singular promises, that they should have a chance to try to accomplish those things. There's no guarantee, right, that the legislation is successful. People can still vote against it. It can still fail in committee. Like there's all of these barriers that exist to the process. But the notion that, oh, you've won the power, you've written the bill, you've gotten it through committee, it's on the floor, and now if unless you can get 60 votes, you can't vote on it. That just seems silly to me. That's like that. You might as well just say, I don't want anything. I don't want the
Get anything
legislature to
done.
govern. Yeah, I don't want anything to have happen. And if that's how you feel, I think people should say that. But if you want Congress to get things done, then you can't have the filibuster. It's like one or the other.
Well, I've been there when we had it, and when I got to the Senate, I was the 60th vote, so we were able to do the Affordable Care Act. Thank God.
Yeah.
They tried to get rid of it, and John McCain put his thumb down.
Which I think gets to my point, right? That like they could have gotten rid of it with a simple majority vote, and it turns out they couldn't assemble a coalition. And it's like, yeah, I think that's how it should work. And had John McCain voted for it, then we can all organize the vote against them and like elect a new Congress and a new president that can fix it.
Are you worried that we elect Trump and we elect a Republican Senate and a Republican House?
That's a good question. I think that's unlikely because I do think that, the House vote typically goes along with the presidential vote. And I don't think there's a scenario in which Trump wins the presidency with the majority of the overall popular vote. And just depending on the disparity, like if it's like Biden, Biden won by about 7 million votes or so.
7 million, yeah.
But it was like 40,000 votes between 3 states that determine the outcome.
It was 4 states.
4 states.
Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Wisconsin.
So if that's reversed, right, and Harris wins 7 or 8 million more votes, but Trump gets the Electoral College, I think Democrats have the House in that world. But if it's like 3 million votes
Right.
and Trump wins the Electoral College,
Yep.
which was what happened with Clinton. Clinton was 2.1 million votes. Then I think Trump could have the House as well. So it kind of depends on that popular vote margin.
Yeah. So, and since you pointed out, we just don't know what you suggested of having a filibuster proof, just go majority rules. It is possible that Trump can get in there with both houses.
Yeah.
Okay. That seems like a really good positive note to end on.
I mean, okay, if you're someone who follows polls, I just looked at a new national poll from Echelon Insights, and it has Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump head-to-head 52-45. So
Okay.
that's good.
That's good. But as you pointed out, we can't rely on those polls.
Can't rely on those polls.
Well, it was great relying on you today, which I did. I leaned on you a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.